Good afternoon. I would like to welcome you to the Krasno Global Event Series at UNC-Chapel Hill. It is great to see so many of you online today. And today our event comes to you from the Woodrow Wilson Center in downtown Washington, D.C. Our distinguished speaker today is Robert Daly, who I will introduce to you in a minute. I'm Klaus Larres, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs at UNC-Chapel Hill. At present, I'm a Global Europe and China Institute Fellow here at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Let me just point out that, as always, we are videotaping the event today for our famous YouTube channel, on which the videos of all our events can be watched again and again and again. The address is youtube.com/KrasnoUNC. We have a great international Zoom audience today, and everyone is most welcome to submit your questions to our speaker today by making use of the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. After my conversation with our special guest, our highly efficient Krasno assistant today, Willow Chang, will select your questions and read them out aloud to all of us. Western relations with China have been full of tension, have been in deep crisis for quite a few years now. The Biden-Xi summit meeting in San Francisco in late 2023 has improved things a little. But what really is the situation today regarding US-China and Europe-China relations? What is China's Russia policy? What is happening regarding Taiwan? And what is going on inside China regarding the economic situation in China, but also regarding the purge of leading Chinese politicians and military officers? How can we understand Xi Jinping's leadership today? For all of this and more, we have Robert Daly with us today. Robert is one of America's best experts on China. He's also the director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Earlier in his career, Robert served as a diplomat at the US Embassy in Beijing and as an interpreter for Chinese and US leaders, including President Carter and Henry Kissinger. Robert also headed the China programs at Johns Hopkins University, at Syracuse University, and at the University of Maryland. He has testified before Congress, and he is regularly called upon by the global media. He is a very busy man. And Robert also taught Chinese at Cornell University, and he worked on television and theater projects in China as a host, as an actor, and as a writer. For example, he helped to produce the Chinese language version of Sesame Street, and in China, he is still recognized today as the actor who in 1994 played in a Chinese TV series entitled A Beijinger in New York. Robert Daly, welcome. It's great to have you here at the Krasno event series today.
It's good to be with you, Klaus. Thanks for having me.
No, thanks for joining us. Let me ask you straight away. There's much concern about China in the Western world at present. We hear about Chinese militarization and about the technological disinformation and cybersecurity threat from Beijing. We often hear about many other terrible things. How dangerous is China actually? Are we witnessing a Chinese replacement of the United States as the world's most important country, or has everything been much exaggerated and we really should adopt a very different perspective on Chinese politics today?
So there's an awful lot in that question. Certainly, the challenge from China, many would say the threat from China, has often been mischaracterized and exaggerated. You hear that it is an existential threat to the United States. You hear people in Washington say that. That's wrong. They're not an existential threat. As a threat, an existential threat is a threat to our existence. That's not what it is. This is not a search for Lebensraum. This is not the Third Reich that wants to take over vast territories beyond those that China doesn't control, but has always claimed that should be within its grasp, namely Taiwan and the island features in the South China Sea. It is also not like the former Soviet Union. That China is not trying to turn the entire world into a country that is governed as China is governed. And we'll come back to that. There's a caveat there. But this is mostly China for China, acting on the world stage. I think that where our focus needs to be, and you mentioned technological concerns, questions about espionage, intellectual property theft, there's a whole debate about influence. I think that what we need to focus on is China's challenge to what is often called the existing world order. Now, that's a tricky phrase. Washington sometimes speaks very defensively about upholding the rules-based order as though it is established and uncontested and complete, unevolving. None of those things is true. Nevertheless, China, it is clear, while upholding many aspects of existing international systems and processes, benefiting from many of them and contributing to them, is also increasingly trying to stand up an alternate set of systems of processes, financial systems, technological systems to which other countries could have access and need. And this new set of systems and processes, which is beginning to take shape, it's still a little fuzzy, is supported by Russia in many ways, by Iran and others. And what it does is what it purports to do is to offer options to countries that don't want to have their choices shaped by the West and by America in particular.
So is it correct when I said that the Chinese are about to replace the United States as a major power? Because what you say is that setting up of an alternative order means, of course, that the old order, the American-led order, is being substituted, is being replaced.
Is certainly being challenged, or in some ways it's being diminished. Now, again, it's hard to get the right words for what China is trying to do. Does China want to, as some people in Washington say, dominate the world? No, China actually doesn't care about most of the world enough to want to dominate it. It certainly doesn't want to take on the real problems of non-Chinese peoples. It is trying to get the things that China badly needs for its continued development, including its technological development. And it is definitely, and again, this is where we need to focus, it is trying to shape global norms, global practices, beliefs, to be more, such that we have a global governance system, which is more like the governance system within China. And that, I think, is very, very concerning. I am a long-time engager with China. I plan to continue engaging with China. I've benefited personally from doing so deeply. There's an awful lot that I love and admire in that country. But if the question is asked, what percentage of influence does the global system and global values and global ideas about governance need from the Chinese Communist Party? My idea is that 0 is about right. 0 is what we should be shooting for. That doesn't mean that China doesn't have interests. It certainly does. It doesn't mean that China doesn't have prerogatives. But if it's a question about how we want to live and be governed internationally, I prefer the more liberal set of norms. Imperfect and occasional as they may be, it's still the better choice, I think, certainly for any country with democratic aspirations.
Yeah, thank you. Let's turn to American-Chinese relations, and then we also cover some other countries in the world. When you look at the current relationship, it does seem to have slightly improved since the Biden-Xi meeting in San Francisco. So would you agree with that? And do you think we are on a course of stabilization which will continue for some time, or are you more skeptical?
I'm more skeptical. It's true that the atmospherics have improved, and that's no small thing. Biden and Xi and their summit in San Francisco essentially agreed that both countries do not want to go to war, and they want to put mechanisms in place, dialogues to try to prevent that. That's terrific. But of course, the fact that they now recognize that maintaining peace, avoiding war is the foundation of the relationship is also a recognition that the potential for conflict has gone up. And so while they speak of stability and while the rhetorical temperature has lowered, that's good. Neither Xi nor Biden has reconsidered his own interests, his strategies, his assessments of his own country's role, his assessments of the threat of the other. There's been no rethink in either Beijing or in Washington. So it's sort of a mere lowering of the temperature, which has to be done. But none of the conditions that led us to this point of mutual hostility has really been addressed on either side. And while both sides talk of stability, they mean different things. The U.S. means, when it says it wants to stabilize U.S.-China relations, it means it wants to continue to prosecute the same China policy that it's been prosecuting without increasing the chances of conflict. And when China says it wants stabilization, it means it wants the United States to stop prosecuting those policies. It wants it to shut up, and it wants to be left alone to focus primarily on its domestic economy, but also to develop its international relations as it sees fit. So they both use this word stabilization. They don't mean the same thing.
And when you say there are serious problems which are simply continuing, which problems would you point to in particular? Are we talking about a strategy of, as it is fashionably called, decoupling or de-risking? Is that what the United States pursues? Or where are the major choking points?
Well, both countries, of course, have been decoupling. Made in China 2025, with its targets to have 70% global market share, is a decoupling strategy in a slightly different form. And I'm not saying, oh, China started it, they did it first. That's not what I'm pointing out. I'm merely saying that both countries have enormous security concerns about the other. China has security concerns about the West broadly. America's concerns are shared in Japan and Tokyo and Australia and Europe and a growing number of other countries. They don't want to be unduly exposed to each other. We are exposed by China's dominance in critical minerals, rare earths, which are often discussed, medical precursors, solar cells, EVs, electric vehicles, lithium batteries, all that technology. China is far ahead of us. And the legacy chips, the older kinds of processors that go into most of the objects that America owns, were dependent on China. China also has dependencies in the high-tech area, arguably in agriculture. There are other areas as well. And we don't trust each other enough to be in each other's hands for vital imports. So that's the impetus for decoupling on both sides. But again, it really is the world order piece. That is the reason that both countries are trying to strengthen alliances and partnerships and bring other countries, including nations in what we now call the global south, no one likes that term, more to its side. America is convinced that China means to be, as you suggested, the single most powerful and influential country on earth. And we see that not as an existential threat, but as a major challenge and something that we are going to counter them on. It's going to be a fight, hopefully a cold fight, not a hot fight, but it's going to be a fight. And China believes that we want to carry out containment, regime change, and support for Taiwan independence.
If you were dragged to the White House tomorrow to advise President Biden as a major policy advisor on China, what would you recommend how to change course and in what way to change the current relationship with China?
Well, I think that the Biden policy is largely correct and has been quite effective in limited ways. It's invest, align, compete. First, try to make things better in the United States, align, meaning improve our alliances, and then compete full throttle with China to try to make sure that whenever possible, our ways, our models, and not theirs predominate. So I think that's broadly correct, although that takes place under a much broader strategic umbrella that I have some concerns about. And the broader strategic framing is that the United States has a policy of global preeminence. And we have come to think of any even potential threat to our global preeminence, our ability to dominate everywhere all at once if we choose. We've come to see those threats as actual threats to our security. So we've broadened that security framework to I think an unsustainable degree. We're only 5% of the world's population. The rest of the world is rising. We need to be thinking about ways of shifting ideas about American power and its role in the world. So I would like to see some more discussions of that kind. I also would, and this is a minor tweak, but I think that the Biden administration, like administrations before it, has badly neglected public diplomacy. And by public diplomacy, what we mean is American engagement of the Chinese people in a sustained, high-level, respectful conversation, mostly in their own language, about challenges that we face together, about America itself, about American diplomacy. We used to do this. We don't do it anymore. What most of the Chinese people hear from us are threats and insults. We tell them that they are under the Communist Party, slaves or prisoners. Most of them don't feel that way. We're neglecting relations with the Chinese people. So I would like to have every single speech that comes out of the White House vetted by someone who's qualified to do so, asking the question, how is this going to sound to the Chinese people?
That
That's a
sounds like
minor thing, but
yeah,
that would be one of the first things I'd say to them.
that sounds like a good idea. But when listening to you, are you advocating for a world divided into spheres of influence, like a G2 world, where the US has its Atlantic sphere of influence and the Chinese perhaps their Pacific sphere of influence, and we kind of nicely live together, but nicely divided as well?
No, I don't want China to have a Pacific sphere of influence. What I would like is a sustainably, if imperfectly, liberal set of practices, small L liberal, in which countries are seen, more or less as equal, in which they work in a transparent global system. And obviously, the United States has sinned against all these things. Blah blah blah. Yeah, I know that, but it's not the same scale of sinning against that we see in what clearly is China's proposition to the rest of the world. I think it's that liberal global system where there is respect for rule of law, where there is an understanding that, in fact, there are universal values. Xi Jinping rejects that, but he says that there are such things as common values. I think it's those fair and liberal and, above all, transparent and open systems that should be our focus, not on everything that China does domestically that we disapprove of, and not on everything that it does internationally that annoys us. Those will always be there. So we need to get to a place, a new balance. And we should be aiming for, I think, a world in which China has sufficient confidence of its ability to develop and its ability to protect its security within the Indo-Pacific, but isn't able to dominate in the region.
Mm-hmm.
We need a liberal system, a global system that is reliably liberal, if imperfectly liberal. We need a new workable policy for all nuclear powers, an arms control policy, and we need a new, more manageable policy on Taiwan. If we can get that and be confident of those things, then we can lower our guard a little bit and not make rivalry with China an organizing principle of government. We can proceed, they can proceed, knowing that we'll continue to compete, knowing that we'll win some and lose some, but not setting our hair on fire every time we lose. I think that's the kind of place we need to get to.
But reading between the lines when listening to you, does it mean that we, in the end, we do want to transform China into a more liberal state?
I'm not concerned whether we transform it or not.
Yeah.
I would certainly delight in China's becoming a more liberal state, and so would most Chinese. If it's true this is a Cold War, a Cold War is a play for time, right? Time for what? Time for change. A Cold War ends when one country or both lowers its threat perception sufficiently. And that can happen because change in country A, change in country B, and or change in the global system can happen because of change in the United States. So yes, I mean, I don't think that America has the ability to change China in the way that you describe, but it would be a very good day for year or several years. These things take time. If China were to become a more open society, and I think that would also make China a richer, in every sense of the word, society than it is today.
Personally, I fully agree, but if you look at it from the point of view of the Chinese Communist Party, wouldn't the CCP fear that it endangers its continued rule and would guarantee almost its downfall, like what Gorbachev tried to do in the Soviet Union?
So Xi Jinping's CCP would absolutely feel that way. And again, I come back, this is what makes it a Cold War. There's no silver bullet. This is probably the work of decades. But if we, in the shorter term, if we could see China return to genuine reform and opening, and it's going rapidly in the opposite direction, it's an increasingly closed society, and it is anti-reform. And if we would see China cease to want to spread illiberal norms internationally, we would also have a lot of breathing space, even if China continued to develop economically and technologically and to be, as it always will be, an ambitious great power. But yeah, as long as you've got Shiism operative in China and ambitious around the world, that is one of the things that will have this Cold War continue, unless, of course, America becomes so isolationist and disinterested that we simply yield the field of global order building to China and other countries. That's not an unthinkable way that this all ends.
Will she go for a fourth term? What do you think?
Will he go for a fourth term?
Yeah, another term in office.
Yeah, will Trump go for a third if he got a second? We don't know. So yes, I assume that Xi Jinping is still in power for as long as he wishes to be in power, primarily because people in China don't see any alternative. There's an awful lot of dissatisfaction in China now with the end of the COVID period, the long zero COVID lockdowns, as well as with the state of economy now. There is quite a bit of grousing about the government within China and about Xi Jinping, but it's really more in sorrow than anger. It's not revolutionary, so I don't think we're going to see a revolution or a collapse. And it could also change quickly. If China has turned this around in 2 years under Xi Jinping, well, then hail Xi Jinping, right? They've been through a number of these changes. So no, I think that Xi Jinping has put himself in a position where if he resigned and handed things over, he would be very concerned about his legacy, possibly his safety, and certainly his patronage ideas, his patronage network and his ideas. Through the anti-corruption campaign, he's made a lot of enemies. And so he sort of boxed himself into a place where he really has to hold the reins.
Thank you. When you compare the European policy towards China with the American ones, do you see major differences? Do you see more insecurity, more being in two minds how to deal with China, or how would you analyze European-Chinese relations?
Done a lot of work with Europeans on transatlantic China policy over the past few years. I just got back from Spain Saturday night, in which the subject of the conference was how aligned are we? And the answer is that Europe and the United States have become much more aligned vis-a-vis China over the past several years, not because of anything that we've said, not because America is convincing, but because of what China has in fact done. Alarm about China has greatly increased. And the turning point, I think, came not with a de-risking speech a year ago, but with the EU's declaration that China was, among other things, a systemic rival. They mean that. They are committed to that. I've come to think of it in terms of a formula, which is that with reference to China, Europe equals the United States, minus America's concern with maintaining preeminence, minus America's specific interests in the Indo-Pacific, most of which are not European interests, and plus in Europe, a still stronger desire to have strong commercial relations with China, if possible. So with the exception of those three differences, we're largely aligned. But of course, Europe is also concerned about America's durability and reliability as a partner. I think that if there's a second Trump term, then there will be a fundamental break, and strategic autonomy will be the phrase of the day. The notion of strategic autonomy, often mentioned by Macron, is already growing. People are asking what that would mean and whether the EU is actually cohesive and coherent enough to be able to carry out strategic autonomy. This is the question in Europe. Strategic autonomy would not mean that Europe goes running into the embrace of Russia and China. That's clearly not it. But far less reliance on the United States. And that may be a long-term, slower trend, even if it's a second Biden administration. We don't know.
When you talk about a Europe strategy towards China, you probably, and I think most of us, refer to the EU and Commission President von der Leyen, who in 2019 came out with that expression, systemic rivalry. But is Europe really as united as it seems to be at first sight? Because there are 27 member states of the European Union. There's also the British outside the European Union, and not entirely unimportant country within the European context. So do we have a European China policy?
Well, I wouldn't want to tell Europeans that they don't, but they are very aware of the importance of the question that you just asked. They don't know what the answer to that is. The general trend has been toward greater skepticism of China, and that is driven especially by China's support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And every time that China has had an opportunity to revisit that, they have doubled down. I suspect that had that not been the case, had China not supported, so obviously tilted toward Russia and supported Russia, that there were many in Europe who wanted to restart the free trade agreement discussions with China. Those had been problematic. They were then scuttled after the European Union criticized China for what it was doing to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and China sanctioned a number of members of the European Parliament, and then sanctioned, for example, the Berlin think tank Merix, which does excellent work. I recommend it to all of you. They got sanctioned too, and so once China had sanctioned members of the Parliament, that put the FTA on ice. I suspect that ice would have started to thaw by now, were it not for Ukraine. So as I say, there's still more interest in Europe in a commercial relationship. At the same time, there's deep fear of EVs from China, which would just simply destroy the European car market and could do the same here. The EU has launched an investigation into government subsidies and support for cars that are coming from BYD and the other major EV makers. They seem not to see a way to let those in without destroying their own auto industry. And Germany, of course, is especially concerned about this. So I think that's a bellwether. Watch that investigation when its results are made public.
By free trade agreement, you mean that investment agreement of December 2020?
Yes, I'm sorry, the mutual investment agreement. That
was then abandoned in March, April the year after, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. But they haven't lost all interest in it. When I ask my European friends if it could be resurrected, they all shake their heads and say, absolutely not. I'm not convinced, but as long as the situation in Ukraine is as it is, I don't think that it will be reconsidered.
Could it also be the other way around, that China is not totally fully supporting Russia, for example, with lethal weapons, not so far as they say, because of the Europeans? If there wasn't European concern and for maybe the Chinese don't want to lose Europe, they would have perhaps supported Russia more fully. How do you see that?
I don't think so. They ask these questions pretty constantly, and their analyses far from perfect, but pretty good. And they've really already lost Europe in that sense and continue to re-lose it every time they re-meet with Lavrov or Putin or whatever it is. So no, I think that the reason they haven't provided lethal weapons has much more to do with China's desire to be seen as a force for peace, as a leader of the third world, still as a desire to be seen as upholding the right to territorial integrity of most countries, though they won't talk about that with relation to Ukraine, of course. They want to stick to what they have convinced their people is a moral Chinese foreign policy, which derives from China's past victimhood. That's actually very important to the legitimacy narrative of the Communist Party, that China is good. Now, I think they would provide lethal aid to Russia, if they thought that Putin was going to fail such that Russia would be a crippled partner for China, or if, God forbid, Russia should turn back toward Europe. And this is because they do feel they face an existential threat from us, and therefore China must have a powerful partner. That has to be Russia. If they were going to lose that partner, if they feared that, and right now it's not looking that way, then I believe that they would be prepared to provide lethal aid to Russia. They don't like that. I don't think they approve of this invasion. They had good relations with Ukraine beforehand, but because their main issue is competition with the United States and the global West, they need the power on their side that Russia provides.
Thanks. And if you look into the future, if you try to speculate a little bit, are you optimistic about a united or sort of united European policy towards China, or do you think it will all disintegrate?
I don't know enough to answer that. I don't grok Europe in that way. I listen to what my European friends say. They say different things. Europeans and Americans understand that China would like to see some daylight there and drive a wedge into it. We know that. But in terms of where Europe may be headed, I don't know.
Okay. Let's turn towards Taiwan, because Taiwan is the hot potato. That is, everyone in Washington seems to think that an invasion is almost imminent. At least many people in DC have come to that conclusion. I know you are more skeptical of that. And why is that so?
Well, we know what China's beliefs are about Taiwan. We know what its policies are. and we know that those are not going to change. But I think that Xi Jinping's decisions about Taiwan are based, year to year on cost-benefit analysis. What's the cost of moving on Taiwan? What are the benefits? What are the costs of moving on Taiwan and failing? And he's not as rash as Vladimir Putin, nothing like. They would still prefer a peaceful, gradual, voluntary process of what they would call liberating Taiwan or unifying with Taiwan. I would call it incorporating Taiwan. I don't think we need to use their language there. And especially with the economy in such dire straits, the cost of trying and failing, the cost of trying and succeeding slowly, and perhaps even the cost of succeeding rapidly is so great that it would be very harmful domestically, economically, and that could lead to social and political trouble that could mark the end of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think they know that. And so, no, I, as you mentioned, more and more people in Washington are convinced that he plans to move soon. I could be proven wrong tonight, but I think that's a misreading. There are two theories about this. One is that he might move on Taiwan to gin up nationalism and distract from problems at home. That tends to be a theory that comes from international relations theorists, not from people who've spent a lot of time in China. And the second theory is that while China has seen the power differentials with the United States narrowing in its favor over the past several decades, it now sees those power differentials widening to its detriment. And therefore, the theory goes, China is incentivized to move early while those power differentials are as narrow as possible. Again, I think that that's probably wrong. It's an international relations theory. China is going to try, it wants space, yes, for more international influence, but mostly they want to solve their domestic economic and social problems. That is their focus. And again, I don't think Xi Jinping is rash.
Thank you. But what about the argument of the legacy of Xi Jinping? That Xi Jinping is getting older, as we all are getting older, that he sees his legacy of reuniting the motherland slipping away and may therefore do something about the situation.
I think the counter argument to that is legacy schmegacy. Most of the talk about legacy, when we look at the American political system, is nonsense. It's sort of a journalistic lens. Sure, I mean, if he could get Taiwan voluntarily in or begrudgingly in at very low cost at the snap of his fingers, sort of the Thanos snap, I'm sure he would do it. But he can't, and he knows it. He knows that China would be a pariah nation, and that it would be economically crippled at a time when it's already sort of, limping. So, no, I think that the legacy issue is mostly a way that Westerners talk. It's not that China's leaders aren't also vainglorious, but I don't think that that's going to be a driver for something that he wouldn't do otherwise. I don't see any, previous actions of Xi Jinping which indicates that he thinks that way.
And the Ukraine case that has not convinced him to go against Taiwan, quite the opposite when he looks at Putin's problems in Ukraine?
I think that it's while you could have an argument from within the People's Liberation Army that the real lesson of Ukraine is go fast, go now, hit him with everything you've got, devil take the hindmost and clean it up later. No incrementalism, no gradualism, no attempts to limit losses. That's one possible lesson you could draw. But I suspect that the lesson has really been that the West is a little bit more unified than we thought, a little bit more powerful, capable of rapid action. And also the Chinese army, the PLA, is modeled on the Russian army, which, while it's beginning to make more incremental gains after 2 years, has performed abysmally and has driven Finland and Sweden into NATO and has created a raft of other problems, none of which Xi Jinping wants. I would suspect that overall it would cause him to think twice. But again, I don't claim to have access to his mind.
Yeah, and also I think the determination of the West to resist has been proven quite impressively in Ukraine, in the Ukraine war. And I think that was something which probably both Putin and Xi may have underplayed in the past.
And of course, it's a very different case, right? There's no NATO in this case. It's different in a number of ways. And China has also seen that so far the sanctions haven't crippled Russia. Russia has gone onto a full wartime economy and is producing 5 times the number of munitions that it was producing at the front end of the war. So I'm sure that they are all not only studying the incompetence of the Russian army, but they're studying the relative competence of economic planners in lessening the impact of sanctions.
Thank you. Let's turn to the Chinese economy. You mentioned it before that it's quite weak, but how bad and how weak is it at the moment? When you listen to some Chinese journalists, in particular Chinese academics, they play up the Chinese economy, that it's not really all that bad right now, that growth is at 4.5% to 5%, while other experts, particularly Western experts, talk about 1.3% growth
Or
last
zero.
or zero. Well, you tell us. But there is a huge diversity of opinion. What is the situation really like?
So some broad thoughts. I'm not an economist. A lot of economists aren't economists either, as far as I can tell. They look at the same data and reach very different conclusions. I think that we have overhyped the peak China, the China's toast, stick a fork in it, or China, whatever that, I mix my metaphors, is. I think we're hyping that because of our own hopes and fears. We had felt pretty back-footed for a long time by China, and now that they're struggling, we are reveling in it. And journalists and media outlets that should know better, I think, are also doing that. On the one hand, they are facing their biggest economic challenge or crisis since 1978. The problems that they face are deep and structural. There are no quick fixes. So if it were true that this is the big slowdown, such that China doesn't catch the US on GDP terms, such that it doesn't get out of the middle income trap, and such that it can no longer afford its international ambitions. If that happens in China, it is going to happen along the lines that we see now, an inability to solve those structural problems. But it's much too early to make the call. It's much too early. China still has tremendous strengths. The primary strength that it has is it's incredibly hardworking, educated, ambitious, and adaptive population. But there are areas in which they're ahead, as we've talked about when we talked about dependencies that we had. It still has about 600 million people yet to be lifted out of poverty. So there's a possibility of further growth there. Yes, they have a declining and aging population and all the other, I won't go through the list of all the reasons that they're in trouble. I'll assume that your group has known that. But I would argue that they're not still in quite as much trouble as we were in 2008. They could get there, but they're probably not quite there yet. And we weren't done in 2008, right? We speak of our own difficulties, as recessions, and we get over them. And I think that that's still the model we should have when we think about China. I was just in China, and people that I spoke to, both at very high levels and at street level, almost all said some version of, this is really bad. I'm hurting. My family's hurting. We've lost huge amounts of money. They know how horrible this is. But most of them said some version of, after 3 to 5 bad years, we will find a new model. We'll find a new balance. It won't be such rapid growth, but it will be sustainable. It'll probably be based more on domestic consumption, moving up the value chain. They say, 3 or 5 really hard years, and we'll find our sea legs again. That's the attitude that I heard there for the most part. And not a betting man, but if I had to put my money down, I would bet on something like that. So again, could it be true that this is the big slowdown? Yes. And it would have started in this way, and it would develop along these lines. We don't know this yet.
There are economic difficulties in Europe right now, because not least of the energy crisis and the war, Russia-Ukraine. Farmers are taking to the streets, strikes all over the continent from all sorts of groups. Could something like that happen in China, or is the security state too well developed for that?
I think the security state is now too well developed. There is a documentary out now on BBC 4 called Total Trust, which looks at what China's surveillance state, this sort of techno-totalitarian state, is capable of. And the Chinese, when pushed far enough, would demonstrate even in the face of that. I didn't sense that mood when I was in China. I would be surprised to see it. People will still take to the streets over the kinds of things that they've protested for over the past several decades, not getting sufficient payment for their land from local governments that are selling land out from under them. They will still demonstrate against Chinese real estate companies that took all of their money for unbuilt apartments and then lost it. But these are smaller kinds of demonstrations. And most of the kinds of demonstrations that you see in China are not against the central government. They're actually petitioning the central government to solve problems with local governments or in corporations. And that kind of petitioning of the central government, while yes, it's a demonstration, is arguably an expression of faith in that government, right? You think that they're going to solve the problem. So yes, it could go there if we continue, along the trajectory of the past year for 3 or 4 more years. Then I think you would have people who are so frustrated that they would brave the surveillance state. But we're just not there yet. You go to China, and that's not how people are thinking. They're thinking, to be crude, as some Americans do, well, this sucks. How long do we have to put up with this? But how long do we have to put up with this? And that we, for most people, is still the nation as a whole in a way that includes the party. That's my read on it.
Thank you. What is actually going on, as far as we can tell, in the Xi Jinping system and his Politburo? There's the anti-corruption crusade, which is still continuing. We had the disappearance of the foreign minister and the defense minister under very strange circumstances. The sudden death of the previous premier. We have the replacement of military officers, particularly in the rocket force, but also elsewhere. That is all highly unusual, to put it mildly. What is going on? Can you explain?
It is. I mean, there's a question about whether these are dots that can be connected to form a coherent picture. I'm not sure that they are. At a minimum, they have a dreadful vetting system, if there's any vetting system at all. Both Li Shangfu, the Minister of Defense, and Qin Gang, the Foreign Minister, were very recent Xi Jinping appointees who fell almost immediately. I think that the real import of that is that the fall of those guys, like the support of Vladimir Putin on the eve of the invasion of Ukraine, like these really draconian zero COVID policies, all of these are public misjudgments of Xi Jinping's. For his first 2 terms, he was seen as almost omnipotent and omniscient and all-knowing and all-wise, right? He was Xi Dada, and he's made a number of massive public policy blunders. And I think that it calls into deeper question his competence. We don't know if that matters because there are no heirs apparent and no one seems to see any alternative to the Communist Party. But it makes, the claims of omniscience and being perfectly benign and all-knowing, I think, a much harder sell. And we know from the history of the Communist Party that leads to a lot of grumbling and movement and positioning within the party itself. But we can't see it. We know that it must be there, but it's such a well-sealed black box that we don't know. But you mentioned a bunch of things, all of which are in themselves interesting. But again, are they dots that we can connect meaningfully? Is it a bad spell that gets recovered from? I don't know.
But doesn't it go deeper than just a bad selection of certain people, which can happen, of course, to any leader? Doesn't it show more structural discontent that even at very high levels, where even if people turn out to be incompetent, they shouldn't be turning against Xi Jinping, because otherwise he probably wouldn't
So we don't, again, in these cases, we don't know. The generals from the rocket force appear to have been old style money corrupt. We don't know. Qin Gang, it appears likely that he's out for behavioral reasons because he had an affair and fathered an American child by his mistress. Again, that appears to be the case. China's a 24/7 rumor mill, and there are all kinds of conspiracy theories about how Qin Gang was actually involved in espionage, and he was involved in espionage with Li Shangfu. Again, these are not all dots to be connected. They may be individual incidents. I don't know why Li Shangfu is out. The rumor is that his son, who's in the United States, asked for and received political asylum. That's one of the rumors. I have no idea whether that's true, but again, that could be a different case. So I'm still wary. I pay attention to this stuff, but I don't try to string it all together, because a lot of this is just, as you said, things that can happen in any country. Sometimes it rains, it pours, right? We know that through the anti-corruption campaign, he's made a great many enemies. He's torn apart patronage networks. There are a lot of people with a lot of beefs against Xi Jinping, both within the party and the military. And so we theorize that there must be factions. This tension must exist. It always has. But again, we can't see it. So I'm not comfortable guessing.
What about the former premier, Li Keqiang? He suddenly died. That was natural?
Again, I don't know why Li Keqiang died.
I thought you'd heard about it.
No. I mean, there's all this. I don't know if you've seen. There's one of Woody Allen's movies, Hannah and Her Sisters, and Woody Allen is getting upset about death, and he's trying to think about God, and he's arguing with his old parents, and they're saying that there is a God, and Woody Allen says, if there's a God, how come there are Nazis? Why were there Nazis, Dad? And his father says, I don't know why there were Nazis. I don't even know how the can opener works. I mean, that's sort of where I am on these questions. Maybe this, perhaps that. I don't feel like I have anything constructive or clarifying to contribute to that.
Thank you. When you compare the Xi Jinping system with his predecessor, you see huge differences, I assume.
Absolutely. Fundamental differences. China under Deng and Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao was a developmental state. Increased development was the standard against which you measured the effectiveness of your policies. Xi Jinping has taken China from being a developmental state to being a highly ideological security state. That's the big difference. China had been developing, integrating more globally, becoming more liberal, even within China. Personal freedoms, information had been improving, fairly steadily under all of those leaders. And Xi Jinping has reversed that. He's taken it back. It is now a closed society. He'd taken a society that was gradually opening, and he has made it a closed. Sorry, let me fix my camera here. And he has made it a closed society, and it's closing. Those seals are getting tighter and tighter.
You understand his motives. Why did that happen?
Well, again, I think here we're on slightly better ground speculating than about whether he fired Li Shangfu. I think that he actually believes that himself, primarily the Chinese Communist Party and the princelings, have a profound moral mission to develop China and make it strong, that they and only they can carry out. Only they have the insight, the experience to do this. And he believes that reform had gone too far, too fast, resulting in rampant corruption that had to be reined in, and resulting in the devolution of power to NGOs, to corporations, to foreigners in and around China, in a way that was a threat to the Communist Party, and therefore to the stability and the development of China. That it had simply gone too far, and that it had to be reined back in. It was becoming too westernized in a way that was ultimately a conceptual and therefore an existential threat to the Communist Party. I do believe that he thinks he is doing all of this for the good of the country and that it must be done. I think that he likes power, but he doesn't strike me as the megalomaniac type of totalitarian. It's not all about him or personal in that sense, but that he thinks that that the devolution of power, liberalization, corruption are sources of instability that could bring China down, and that it is his sacred mission through the mechanisms of the Communist Party as a second generation Red to do this. That's my broad read.
So the influence of Mao Zedong is high on Xi Jinping.
Yeah, and of the Maoist Communist Party. You know, one of the questions that gets asked a lot is, having seen Mao persecute his father so severely, sent himself to the countryside, driven his sister to suicide, why is he now trying to recreate the system that he saw devastate his family?
Exactly.
Clearly, that's a good question. It's not a question that I think we've answered sufficiently, but he seems to have somehow embraced this system as a source of stability and meaning. But I don't want to, I can't psychologize Xi Jinping. Again, I don't know how the can opener works. It's a complicated question.
Yeah, thank you very much. At the beginning of our conversation, perhaps we close the circle with that before we also ask for some questions from the audience. At the beginning of our conversation, we talked about the global order and the position of the United States and Europe in that order, and how they envisage that order, and what China may think about it. And China seems to have a particularly objective to convince the so-called global South, the developing world, Africa, South America, also the Middle East, increasingly.
Central Asia.
Yes, Central Asia, of its value system and of its perhaps model for international governance. How successful has China been, and will that, where are the risks for China?
So there's one, if you look at the pieces of paper, the descriptions of China's, what they call their global development initiative, their global security initiative, and their global civilization initiative. This, together with the BRI, AIIB, a number of China, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, perhaps BRICS. This is the very vague skeleton of this new proposition that China wants to stand up. And most of it, I say, is exceedingly vague. And it consists of very bland statements that nobody could possibly object to. Development is good. Civilizations should be respected. Peace is better than war. Sort of, laughably simplistic views that nobody can really argue with. But China, I think, does within that have one very clear proposition that is very attractive to developing nations. When the United States and the West talks about the global order, they talk about a highly legalistic set of mechanisms that are designed to do a whole bunch of things. They have they're to guarantee human rights, they're to guarantee clarity of trade regimes, there are a whole bunch of reasons for it. China, its proposal to the developing world is the sole meaning and goal of what we call order is development. That's all it is. That's all it's for. This is what it can be measured by. It's not human rights. It's not anti-corruption. All the other things that we speak about the global order as being conducive to. Their proposition is that you can test global order by how conducive it is to your development. That's very attractive to much of the rest of the world. The other thing I think that the Chinese side has done very effectively, and where I think that we should actually take a page out of their book, is they don't speak about global order in a defensive way. We're in a defensive crouch. Help us defend the global rules-based order from China, Russia, Iran, fill in the blank. China speaks, regardless of what they mean, they speak in a much more expansive, inviting way. They say the world is changing very, very fast in ways we've never seen, along vectors that we do not understand. Join us in trying to understand this, to see what challenges we face, and in getting a set of rules and practices that work for everybody. That's the way that it presents itself to the global South. whereas we present in a defensive crouch, asking the global South to defend something that maybe they don't think works for them so well. And that is something where stylistically, they very rarely steal a stylistic march on us. CCP is not so good at style. This is why they don't develop much in the way of soft power. But here I think that they really are onto something. And we see them making gains also very importantly in the Middle East, where they are extremely well aligned with the Emirates and the richer kingdoms there that want to develop technologies, that want to develop their countries economically, but that do not want to have a vibrant civil society, transparency, or democracy. It's actually a very good match. And I think that it will continue to grow. And so we need, in the face of this, to come out of our defensive crouch and be a little bit more expansive and inviting. Now, there's a lot that China doesn't offer the world, and very few countries look to China for anything but money. They're not looking to it for solutions. And even in Latin America and Africa, I think most people's personal aspirations and institutional aspirations are far better aligned with the West than with China and Russia. But China's bringing more resources to bear. And so these areas are in play. I think that it's incumbent upon us to change the way we describe order and to do something that's more inviting and inclusive.
Yeah, and here your call for more public diplomacy would come in.
This is a piece,
absolutely.
We have circled back around to that.
What we haven't covered, which you should at least mention, though of course we can't possibly do it justice, is both the South China Sea and also the human rights situation, particularly with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. That hasn't become better, the latter problem. It has actually become worse as far as I hear. What is your take on that? Why is that being pursued? Doesn't Xi Jinping realize how antagonistic that is for the rest of the world, or for many parts of the world?
Right. So that last question to me is a key question, because they know that they're under constant fire for these reasons, and the evidence is that they don't care. I think part of the answer, of course, Xinjiang, Tibet, less so with Inner Mongolia. These were previously, as you know, as a historian, these were China's buffer zones. This is where trouble came from. They aren't part of Zhonghua, Tianxia, what is ancient China. Its borders were far smaller. These are the borders. They've shrunk a little bit since the height of the Qing dynasty, but this is basically what the Qing dynasty achieved. And while those have been brought within China's borders and broadly under China's governance, it's never sat comfortably with anybody, not with the Han and not with subject peoples. And so what looks to us in Tibet and Xinjiang clearly like a case of failed ethnic policy, China really sees a threat. And they've borrowed a lot of our language about terrorism when they speak of these threats. They've added separatism and splitism. They see something that could really harm the heartland of Han China. And we can tell, we say, well, you're wrong. You misperceive the threat. It's too great. They simply disagree with that. They see enough of a threat to China, to the notion of China within these borders, that they feel that they must behave in this way. And over time, they will, in all likelihood, succeed. No historical analogy is perfect, but I think the closest with Tibet and Xinjiang is what we did here to the American Indian. It's, their policy is first flood the zone so that there are more Han Chinese in these areas than there are local people, and where the Han Chinese have most of the high-paying jobs. And then you have various policies through education and other means at assimilating the population, which is now a minority in its own homelands. This is all happening within what we recognize is the People's Republic of China. We're not going to war with China over Xinjiang or Tibet. Beijing holds almost all the cards, and they will probably prevail over time. It's a tragedy. It's quite awful to watch unfolding, but I can't see where else that goes. I hate to say it, but that's, I think, what we're watching.
Yeah. Thanks for that sober analysis. Robert, thanks very much. Let's get some questions here. Willow, do we have a few questions?
Many. We kind of wanted to start with a question from Richard Emerson, who asks, the US seems to be struggling with its future directional choices, being either continuing along our current path of global alliances or turning back towards isolationism. Which path brings the greater risk to US-China relations, and which path do you believe China would prefer that we take?
The first part of that is, I think that China would obviously prefer that we take the path of isolation, that we cede the field of shaping global order and just sort of take our toys and go home. That there would be difficulties for China in that too. And obviously what I just described is a cartoon of what that would look like. It's not so sudden, it's not so absolute, but they would obviously prefer that. I think that for our friends and allies, while they have problems with the way that the United States has carried out its global role since World War II, on average, it's worked pretty well for them. They don't know how to deal with the United States if it becomes a new country, a different country every 4 years. They will, lose faith there. I think it's, we can't succeed in order shaping and trying to have a more liberal order unless we can rebuild a consensus about America's role in the world. We had that from World War II, really until President Trump. There was a consensus about the need for American leadership. The parties disagreed about aspects of that. But fundamentally, the international affairs experts in the Republican and the Democratic parties are pretty close together. One is more realist school, one is more liberal, but they all agreed. So can we get a coherent, consistent, Washington word, operationalizable view of America's role in the world? If we can't, a lot of other countries have strong desires to go their own directions, or they have their own clear ideas about where this might go. So I think that's our challenge. I'm a little bit dismayed here. As I said, I'm really quite strongly supportive of the Biden administration's approach to China. I think that they have made a mistake in not articulating a new vision of an American global role. It would have to be new, but that says that no, America, in fact, exists on the face of the globe. Globalization can be a good thing that works in our benefit, and here's how, and to have a real campaign to get the American people back on board. Instead, they seem to have adopted a Trump view. The Biden people are much stronger on building alliances, but it's still sort of an anti-globalist view that suggests in an extreme form that the measure of our foreign policy is factory jobs in the middle of Pennsylvania. There's not no relation between those two, but factory jobs are not the measure of foreign policy, right? We've gone too far.
But that seems to be necessary to win the next election, I guess. That is the reasoning.
Right, but it's been the theory of the case since day one, with no attempt to describe anything else, or the many ways that globalization has worked for the United States and for the rest of the world, without sufficient recognition that how the rest of the world does and how they think matters, and it's consequential for the United States. It's our neighborhood.
I quite agree. Even a free trade agreement between the transatlantic partners is not anywhere to be seen.
No.
But we won't go into that. Willow, do we have another question, please?
Yeah, we have a related question. So from multiple people. So Scott Schwartz mentions a recent WSJ article, the US to invest billions to replace China-made cranes at nations' ports. Was this more of a symbolic move? How actually economically impactful is this? And clearly the US government wants less Chinese involvement in our infrastructure. But how on board with this are American firms?
Well, Chinese run ports pretty well. And they've invented one of the world's premier systems, which includes software and the movement of containers off of ships into ports, onto trucks, into trains. They do this very effectively. The biggest concern here is data. The software that runs these programs also gathers all of the data, which the fear is, one, the software can be turned off. This can get into infrastructure, can be weaponized. And number two, that it brings insights that can be harmful to our security. I haven't looked closely. I read the Wall Street Journal article. It's very hard to tell when this stuff is overblown and when it's legitimate. The suggestion that we can't have any Chinese involvement anywhere where China has, actually a great deal to offer, and in some cases can help solve problems and build prosperity. I think it's going to be tough to see, no Chinese involvement in any of these American systems, which by extension, because these are all global systems, it ties into American allies. So are we going to be asking American allies to also do the same? Or is this an attempt on behalf of a certain lobby to sell American-made cranes and therefore to invoke the China boogeyman, right? We've seen many examples of this, an ability to pass pass legislation that's linked to an alleged Chinese threat, sometimes on thin evidence. And again, it's not to say that there is never a threat. There are a lot of American systems that I wouldn't let China near, right? I would not let Huawei into our 5G system. But I think we need to take it on a case-by-case basis, and need to have evidence that there, really could be a security threat coming from Chinese involvement. So I don't mean to deny that there are threats. There are absolutely threats. And I don't have any, there's a growing interest in invoking reciprocity. If China won't let us into industry X in China in a certain way, we shouldn't let it in here. Now, that's in many cases impracticable, but it's not a bad starting place to simply say to China. Most of your listeners probably don't remember who Ross Perot was, but he used to say when he was running for president, "I'll give you the deal you gave me." We can't be too religious about that, but it's not a bad place to start. And if we can't operate ports in China, then let's maybe not, maybe we shouldn't let them operate ports here. But then we need to look to it at each case in our interest. I'm sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but it's because this stuff gets, it's thrown out too easily that if China's involved, then all hell has been, released in the American ports.
Talk to us briefly about export controls and sanctions, particularly in the chip industry, semiconductor industry. Does it really solve the problem, or does it simply push the Chinese to develop their own industries even more vigorously than they would have done anyway?
Well, it certainly pushes China to reinvest and to develop more rigorously, but it does slow them down nevertheless. And the strategic idea here, the strategic rationale for the export controls is very clear, and it's one that I think that most Americans would support. We're not going to sell you technology that goes into weapons that target us, right? That's perfectly clear, but it's also a very absolute strategic rationale, which once you state it, you can't really walk it back. And once you state it, it tends to expand so that it will certainly comprise, nano and quantum when they're ready. It comprises material science, which is basic research. We're talking about, high walls in a small yard, but that yard is going to continue to grow. The other thing that's tricky about this is it's a Cold War move. I think it's impossible to deny that this is in part a Cold War and that we are containing China through policies of this kind. It also, within China, amounts to an announcement on the part of the United States that the Chinese people are not to have all of the benefits of advanced computing and artificial intelligence if we can help it. And that takes in things like cures for cancer and synthetic medicine and irrigation and education and transportation. So we've shown our cards in that way. And again, I'm broadly supportive of it because the strategic rationale is reasonable. It'll slow China down. It won't stop them. But maybe slowing them down is important. Maybe we should still do it. I go back and forth on this one.
Okay, before you join the Biden administration, you have to make up your mind, I guess.
There haven't been any phone calls. I sit here quite contentedly at the Wilson Center.
Second term. Willow, do we have another question, please?
Yeah, so turning to talk a little bit more about Taiwan. What would be the reactions, and particularly the military reactions, of Japan and South Korea if China makes serious moves on Taiwan? And could their reactions potentially deter China or simply push tensions higher? And this question is from Stuart Kaplan.
Japan has made it very clear that if China moved militarily on Taiwan, that Japan's interests would be affected, and that there would be a response, and that they would somehow be involved. What that means more specifically, I don't know. I'm sure that there are people at the Pentagon who have a pretty good idea. Korea is a very different case. Korea, as you know, it calls itself a shrimp among whales. And so the goal of the shrimp among whales is to, sort of avoid all the whales. I spend a lot of time with Korean colleagues in Korea and here. In fact, I'll be going out west this weekend to meet with Japanese and Korean China watchers to talk about these issues. The Korean view is we highly value our alliance with the United States. It is the cornerstone of our security. It means the world to us. Just please don't ask us to do anything under that alliance. Come to us last and in extremis, right? Please don't ask us to move in because they're so close to China. They're connected by land. They can be more easily coerced or harmed by China. And I think in general, Washington understands Korea's concerns. We understand its position. We understand that American assets that are based in Korea, if they were moved into Taiwan from Korea, that could be escalatory and would be a major problem for our South Korean allies. We know that, but that's about as far as I can go.
Thank you. I'm sure we have some more questions.
We do. We have a question from Louis Krishock, actually also from the Wilson Center. It seems like a sizable number of members of China's middle class and knowledge economy agree with Keynes when he said, in the long run, we are all dead and are voting with their feet. How big of a threat is this to China and its economy going forward?
We don't know the answer to that yet. But it's true that a lot of people who have the ability to leave are leaving. They're getting their families and as much of their capital out as they can. And they're setting up family corporations in Singapore. They're coming to Canada, to some degree to the United States, and going to Japan, South Korea. There are very strict limits on capital outflows in China, but they're finding creative ways to get around that by, for example, buying insurance products in Hong Kong. And they're moving out. But far from all of them. You may remember there's a story when we were getting ready to establish formal diplomatic relations with China in 1979. There was a lot of concern about, under the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, about free emigration. And this came out of the Soviet experience where people like Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn couldn't leave China. And we asked, Deng Xiaoping, how many students will you let go to the United States? And his answer was, how many do you want? There's a strong sense in China, there are always more people. And there's also, I think, a bit of a sense, although it's not policy, that if the malcontents leave, that raises the levels of contentedness among the people who are behind. I mean, China has, I don't know whether they designed this deliberately or not. I suspect they didn't. I think they evolved into it. But they've got this great pressure release valve in that you're not trapped in China. If you're not imprisoned, you can get out. And this is one of the reasons, Westerners ask, why did this theory that if, China had more liberal capitalism, it would become politically liberal, why didn't that happen? The answer is that theory assumed that people whose thinking was liberalizing were trapped within China. And they're not. They can leave. So I don't, among the long list of China's problems, FDI tanking, stock markets are in trouble, real estate, the demographics problem, the pollution problem, which is still major, indebtedness of local governments. This one to date is still not in the upper tier of those concerns, is my sense.
Thank you. China is increasing its nuclear arsenal quite significantly. Why is that the case? Because 300 atomic bombs are well sufficient to defend yourself and to destroy the globe. You don't need 1,500, do you?
Well, of course, this is where China and a great many other countries turn the mirror around and ask the same questions of the United States. China is going for nuclear parity with the United States and Russia. They have a nuclear triad. They can launch from sea, air, and land. They have gone beyond their small deterrent force. They have a no first use doctrine, and they still claim to have a small deterrent force. So one of the questions that they're asking out at the Stratcom in Omaha is, what is China's nuclear doctrine? And my answer to that is capability is doctrine. You don't need to ask that question, when they're going for parity. Say China feels that it's under threat, but China also feels that it's a great power. And I think that part of this is simply doing what the other big dogs do, right? That now that they have the ability, and they see that that has worked out for Russia in some ways and for the United States. And so they don't want to fall behind on any index of power. I think that there's an element of this that is that simple. They still have a no first use doctrine. We'll see how long that lasts, and they still refuse to get involved in strategic stability talks with the United States and Russia. Their claim when they had a small deterrent force was that they would speak to us about drawing down, about other limitations, or about denuclearization when we drew down to their level. Now they're rising quite very, very rapidly to our level. So there's one question, of course, is if they rise successfully and that rapidly to our level, do they then exceed it? You can see reasons why they may. So this should be one of the 2 or 3 major foci of our China policy, and indeed our international policy, arms control, and trying to reach new agreements, a common vocabulary, a common sense of the nuclear threats, which we achieved after the Cuban Missile Crisis with the Soviets, but which we don't have with China.
Thank you. Perhaps we need another major crisis, but that wouldn't be a good thing either. Willow, the next question, please.
Brian Keeloff asks, there are significant numbers of Chinese students, Chinese PhD students, studying in the US. Do they want to, and are they expected to go back after finishing their studies?
This is moving slightly. You hear that more and more Chinese students are going back. That's true. Most of those going back are people who came here for undergraduate or master's study. So there's been a huge wave of these students who are studying. Many of them are studying finance, economics, accounting, and they mostly go back. They come here intending to have an American experience, and then they go back. There's been a lot of work done on this, notably by David Zweig in Hong Kong, which shows that clearly most of the best of the STEM PhD students still stay here and want to. Whether or not they plan to do that when they come, that isn't clear. But most of them stay here for reasons that are professional as well as personal. They feel they're actually able to make their greatest contribution and do their work here. So this is still, I think, a great American strength. Fewer Chinese students are attracted to come here. Those numbers are going down, not catastrophically. And if you want to be tops in many, many of the STEM fields, you still really have to come here. And then if earlier in your career you want to develop and do cutting edge research, you still in many cases have to be here. So this is still a big advantage. I worry more about things that the American government might do to push them out and scare them out than I do about China cutting off the flow.
Thank you. Willow, please. Yeah, somewhat related question. This is my personal question. Do you expect the closed nature of Chinese society and economy to continue to be beneficial for them? Might we expect a change in this standard? Or would we expect it to become perhaps even more closed in the future?
I think its course under Xi Jinping is clear. I think that it's going to become even more closed in almost every way. And I think that that's what the Chinese themselves are expecting. Any real return to reform and openness requires Xi Jinping and the Communist Party to relinquish power. No one sees that coming under Xi. You've got to give him very high marks for consistency. And it has been about accruing as much power in every sphere as possible, in every sphere to the Chinese Communist Party. And so, no, they are becoming more closed. And I think that Xi is in some ways either naive or blind, deaf, and dumb to this. He spoke in San Francisco about trying to attract 50,000 American students to China over 5 years. Well, there's no demand at anywhere near that level. There are not going to be 50,000 people, knocking at the gates. And when they do go, while the Great Wall is still awesome, and the Chinese people are some of the best hosts in the world, and they're wonderful cultural ambassadors, and you can have a lot of great experiences in China. I think now that more than ever, young people would go and they would just see that they can't get on Google or YouTube or use social media. This is the daily experience is frustration at being cut off from the world. And you ask this very successful, wealthy country with aspirations to global leadership why this is, and they say, well, this is China's law. It's a non-answer. It's grossly off-putting. And so I think that even those students who go are going to feel slapped in the face by this closed society. Yes, there are VPNs, there are other ways to get around it, but it's illegal in a country that's worried that foreigners are spies. People's parents don't want them to go. So no, I think the Chinese say, you know, Neijian, or which is this turning inward, or they call it Xi Chaoxian, you know, Western North Korea, that these forces are still strengthening within China.
Thanks, Robert. We are rapidly running out of time. Therefore, I need to ask you about the South China Sea and what is happening there and how serious the crisis is. Has it become better since San Francisco a little bit as well? And is China generally feeling encircled by the Quad, by AUKUS and these Western organizations which seem to all be directed against China?
So we had seemed, you know, for the past few years to have reached a slightly more stable new normal in the South China Sea before the tensions between the Philippines and China, you know, heated up again. In the South China Sea, that's the area of greatest concern. And so tensions there, I think, are increasing, but I think we have also together gotten a little bit better at managing these, at looking at things like, you know, codes for unexpected encounters at sea. We're talking about that. There's more comfort in talking about the South China Sea, which is more crowded, but making that work, than there is, say, in the Taiwan Strait. Yes, China's concerns about being encircled are very real, and they have seen the Biden administration has, from the military point of view, from the military deterrence or readiness point of view, has actually been very successful in the region, not only with AUKUS, but also with widening the mandate of AUKUS to include hypersonics and other kinds of high tech, and to include AI. It has been successful less dramatically and less specifically with the Quad, which other countries, including South Korea, have flirted with joining. NATO now says it has China-facing concerns. There is a delicate rapprochement between South Korea and Japan, which we were key in bringing about. It's delicate. And Japan is, you know, looking again at its defense budgets and has said that the attack on Taiwan would invoke its interest. So all of this has been done by a very activist, I think quite effective Biden administration. My only critique of that is I wish that we were as active and as effective in the diplomatic and especially in the economic realms. But that doesn't seem to be in the cards. We're not going to join CPTPP. But yes, China is more worried because we've been more active and we've had considerable success under Biden in the Western Pacific with the deterrence agenda.
Thanks very much. We have time for a couple of more questions, I hope. Willow, do we have any?
We do have a question from Brian Keeliff, a fun question. What are the scriptures behind your right shoulder on your desk?
What are the scriptures behind my, let's see, my right shoulder?
Your
Did you
right
say
shoulder.
sculptures or scriptures?
I think sculptures. He meant sculptures.
This is my Hieronymus Bosch collection. If you know the Garden of Earthly Delights, you'll recognize this guy and all the little monsters dancing on his head. And here too, these are from other The Temptation of St. Anthony and other Hieronymus Bosch paintings, which mean a lot to me. So that's my Bosch corner there.
You don't have a little Mao or Xi Jinping plaque on your desk.
I do not have a Mao plaque. I do have, I would have to get up, and I have two Deng Xiaoping statues, one from mainland China when they made such things. He's sitting in his chair with his antimacassars, and they actually made him with a spittoon. And then I've got a Taiwanese statue of Deng Xiaoping, which has him wearing black cat and white cat slippers. But they're a little bit, they're back there, but they're a little bit out of range.
So Deng is your hero.
Deng is not my hero. Cartoon statues, I like cartoon statues. I've got, you can't see. I'm glad that it's become acceptable for adults to bring toys into the office and line them up. This is a very welcome cultural development, and there are a lot of toys in this office.
Thank you very much. Willow, do we have another question?
Sounded like that was the last one.
We do have more. They go back to less fun topics.
We have one or two questions, then we'll have to go. Quick question.
All right, well, Brian Keeloff asks, China has huge U.S. government bonds. Do they use those as negotiating weapons as to potentially cause a U.S. economic crisis?
No, this was always played up. I think we got this one wrong right away, right along. You know, Hillary Clinton said that China was our banker. China's not our banker. China buys a lot of America's treasury bills because they have a trade surplus and they're looking for some place to park their dollars where they can get a safe return. And that is still American debt. And so that's why they do that. They don't do it in a favor for us. They do it for them. They have been slowly drawing down the level of American T-bills in their international mix because they don't want to be exposed. If they sold them all at once to try to hurt us, they would actually hurt themselves because they would get a much lower price for those. So that's not a big, you don't hear so much about this because I think that people finally came to understand, you know, and you used to hear gross misstatements by major American media saying that, you know, China held most of our debt. No, China was the number 1, 2, or 3 largest foreign holder of American debt, but most American debt is owned by Americans. And so this was exaggerated, misstated, misunderstood for a very long time. And some of the things we're concerned about vis-a-vis China now have that same quality, I think.
Thank you very much. Robert Daly, I would like to thank you for all your efforts and for your analysis, your insightful answers. I think they've helped us a lot to understand what is going on inside China today and also what is China's outlook onto the wider world and how, of course, the Europeans and above all the Americans are trying to deal with a still rising China. Also, thank you to Willow Chang for asking the questions. And above all, thanks to our Krasno events audience. It's great to see all of you again. We will have more events coming up in the future. And of course, I will keep you posted. For the time being, please check out our YouTube channel where you will find all our past events and you can watch them all over again as many times as you wish. Thanks again to Robert Daly from the Woodrow Wilson Center for being our special guest today. Thank you and good night.
Thank you, Klaus. Thanks, Willow.
Bye-bye.